Racist cop arrests a black woman for no reason, unaware she's Shaq O'Neal's mother. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Shaquille O'Neal eased his gleaming Rolls-Royce onto the quiet streets of Macon, Georgia. The luxury vehicle purred softly, a testament to both his success and the purpose behind his journey. Today wasn't just any day. It carried a weight of significance that Shaq could feel deep in his bones. Beside him sat his mother, Lucille O'Neal, her presence a steady, comforting constant in his life. They were headed to the Atlanta Civic Center for an event titled Voices of Inspiration, Overcoming Adversity. The name alone stirred something in Shaq, a reminder of the obstacles he and his mother had faced and conquered together. As they cruised through the awakening city, Shaq glanced at his mother. "You ready for this, Ma?" he asked, his deep voice carrying a mix of excitement and respect. Lucille smiled, her eyes twinkling with pride. "Always ready, baby. This is important work we're doing." They fell into an easy conversation about their roles as keynote speakers. The event wasn't just another speaking gig. It was a platform to empower black voices and celebrate those who had made a difference in their communities while overcoming racial and societal challenges. It was a cause both near and dear to their hearts. "Remember when we first moved to Newark?" Lucille asked, her voice taking on a nostalgic tone. "Those early days weren't easy, but look at us now." Shaq nodded, memories flooding back. "You always made sure I had what I needed, even when times were tough. That's what I want to talk about today, how your strength shaped me." Their conversation flowed effortlessly between memories and the impact they hoped to make through their speech. They spoke of growing up facing discrimination and how they used their platform for advocacy. It was a dialogue filled with laughter, moments of solemn reflection, and an underlying determination to make a real difference. "You know, Ma," Shaq said, his tone turning more serious, "I've been thinking about what to say about facing discrimination. It's not always the big, obvious things. Sometimes it's the small stuff that really chips away at you." Lucille nodded thoughtfully. "That's right, baby. And that's what people need to hear. It's not just about the headlines, it's about those everyday battles we face." As they delved deeper into their discussion, the clock on the dashboard blinked to 8:45 a.m. Suddenly, Shaq's phone buzzed with an insistent reminder. He glanced at it, his eyes widening slightly as he remembered the important business call scheduled with Coach Mike Krzyzewski, better known as Coach K. "Oh shoot," Shaq muttered, reaching for his phone. "I almost forgot about the call with Coach K." Lucille raised an eyebrow. "Business call, Shaq?" "Yeah," he said, brow furrowing. "It's about that youth mentorship program we've been working on. It's important, but—" He trailed off, glancing at his mother. Lucille, ever practical, noticed the concern on her son's face. She knew how significant this call was, especially with Coach K's involvement. Without missing a beat, she spoke. "Well, why don't you let me drive? That way, you can focus on your call without worrying about the road." Shaq hesitated, his protective instincts kicking in. "I don't know, Ma. You sure about that?" But Lucille was already unbuckling her seatbelt. "Shaquille," she said, using his full name in a tone that brooked no argument. "Do you know how many accidents are caused by people driving while on the phone? I'm not having my son become a statistic." Reluctantly, Shaq got out of the driver's seat. "Now get in the back," Lucille instructed, settling behind the wheel. "You'll be able to focus better this way." Shaq protested. "Ma, I can't sit in the back while you drive. What if someone sees us? They'll think I'm making you chauffeur me around." Lucille chuckled. All right, front seat it is. But you better give that call your full attention." As they settled back into the car, the roles reversed, Shaq couldn't help but smile. Even with all his success, his mother still knew how to take charge when it mattered most. The Rolls-Royce glided smoothly onto Interstate 75 southbound, its polished exterior gleaming under the morning sun. Long shadows stretched across the wide highway, marking the early hour. Road signs flashed by, indicating the roughly 2-hour journey ahead to Atlanta. Traffic flowed with unusual ease, creating perfect conditions for their drive. As Lucille settled into the rhythm of highway driving, Shaq offered a gentle warning from the passenger seat. "Ma, you know the Georgia State Patrol is pretty vigilant along this stretch, right?" Lucille's warm laugh filled the car, always enough to bring a smile to Shaq's face. "Boy, who do you think taught you to drive? I was handling cars long before you could even reach the pedals. Don't worry about me," Lucille said confidently, her steady control over the luxury vehicle clear. The Rolls-Royce responded to her touch as if it had been made just for her hands. "I bet I'm driving smoother than that chauffeur of yours," she teased, her eyes twinkling with mischief. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. All right, I know when I'm beat. Mom knows best, right?" As the clock on the dashboard neared 9 a.m., Lucille glanced at her son. "It's almost time for your call, baby. Don't keep Coach K waiting." With a nod, Shaq initiated the call through the car's integrated system. The crisp sound of ringing filled the cabin, a testament to the vehicle's premium speakers. After a few moments, Coach Mike Krzyzewski's voice greeted them. "Shaq, good to hear from you." Coach K's familiar voice rang through the speakers. "Coach, thanks for taking the time," Shaq replied, settling into business mode. "I'm excited to discuss this youth mentorship program." As the two men exchanged pleasantries, Lucille felt a swell of pride. Her son, now discussing important business with one of the most respected figures in basketball, was a far cry from their humble beginnings. The conversation quickly shifted to the details of the youth mentorship program they were developing. Shaq's voice grew passionate as they dove into the specifics of the program, which aimed to support underprivileged kids in underserved communities. This work truly mattered to him, a chance to give back and make a real difference. "We're looking at a comprehensive approach," Coach K explained, "not just basketball skills, but life skills, academic support, and community engagement." Shaq nodded, even though Coach K couldn't see him. "That's exactly what these kids need, a holistic approach that prepares them for life, not just sports." "I really believe we can make a difference here, Coach," Shaq said, his enthusiasm clear. Coach K's voice crackled through the speakers, equally passionate. "Absolutely, Shaq. Your experiences, your journey, that's exactly what these young people need to hear. Now, let's talk about the specifics of your role as program spokesperson." As they delved into the details of the promotional video, scheduled visits to Atlanta area schools, and other commitments, Lucille listened with rapt attention. Her son spoke eloquently about helping young people overcome discrimination, drawing from his own experiences and upbringing. The conversation then shifted to sponsorships and commitments, with Shaq agreeing to take on a prominent role in the program, which sparked enthusiasm from Coach K. "You know, Coach," Shaq said, his voice filled with conviction, "I look at these kids and I see myself. I know what it's like to face discrimination and feel like the odds are stacked against you. But I also know what a difference it can make when someone believes in you, when you have the right support and opportunities." From the projects of Newark to this luxury car on a Georgia highway, discussing ways to give back and make a difference, it was a testament to their shared strength and determination. As they continued to brainstorm and plan, the miles flew by unnoticed. The Georgia landscape rolled past their windows in a blur of green and gold, bathed in the morning light. Lucille maintained a steady pace, her driving as smooth and controlled as ever. The Rolls-Royce glided along I-75, carrying mother and son toward Atlanta, with the morning sun rising higher, heralding a bright day ahead. The gentle hum of the car's engine and the rhythmic cadence of the highway lulled Shaq into a calm focus. He was engaged in a group call with his management team and assistant, deep in discussion with Coach K about the mentorship program's details. Suddenly, the serene atmosphere was interrupted by the piercing wail of police sirens. Shaq's head snapped up, his eyes immediately drawn to the rearview mirror, where blue lights flashed ominously. Their reflection danced across the polished surface of the luxury vehicle. For a moment, he hoped the patrol car was after someone else, but as Lucille began to slow down, reality set in. Coach, I'm sorry for the noise, Shaq said quickly, his fingers already working to transfer the call from the car's speaker to his personal earbud. Is everything all right? Coach K's concern was evident, even through the phone speaker. I'm sure it's fine, Shaq replied, trying to keep his voice steady as he watched his mother guide the car to the shoulder. We're on our way to an event in Atlanta, and we got pulled over. It's probably just a routine check. Lucille is handling it. As Lucille brought the Rolls-Royce to a stop, she turned to Shaq with a reassuring smile. Don't worry, baby. I'll handle this quickly. It's probably nothing. You stay focused on your call. Shaq nodded, but the unease in his stomach wouldn't go away. He watched as his mother reached for her license and registration from the glove compartment. Her movements were deliberate and controlled. Even in the face of this situation, she maintained the composure Shaq had always admired in her. He decided to continue his discussion with his team. The crunch of gravel under heavy boots signaled the officer's approach. Shaq tried to focus on Coach K's voice in his ear, discussing the finer points of their agreement, but his attention was split between the call and the unfolding situation outside the car. A tall officer emerged from the patrol car, his movements slow and deliberate. The morning sun glinted off his badge as he approached the driver's side, his hand resting near his holster. He peered into the luxury vehicle, his eyes narrowing and his expression hardening. It didn't go unnoticed by either Shaq or Lucille. Lucille rolled down the window, greeting the officer with practiced politeness. "Good morning, officer. Is something wrong?" The officer's response was clipped and dismissive, a stark contrast to Lucille's warm greeting. "License and registration?" he demanded, not bothering to return her greeting or answer her question. "Yes, sir," Lucille complied, handing over the requested documents with a steady hand. "May I ask why we've been stopped?" The officer's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" "No, I don't," Lucille replied honestly. "Was I speeding?" "I've been careful to stay within the speed limit." The officer's next words came as a surprise to both Lucille and Shaq. "You were driving recklessly, swerving in and out of lanes in the morning traffic?" Shaq, still on the call but listening intently, felt a surge of indignation. He knew his mother's driving had been steady and careful. The accusation seemed absurd. Lucille's response was measured, her years of experience handling difficult situations evident in her tone. "I don't believe that's correct, officer. I've been careful to stay in my lane and keep the speed limit. Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding. Are you arguing with me?" the officer snapped, his cold expression hardening further at Lucille's explanation. It was clear that he interpreted her calm denial as argumentative, even though her tone was respectful. "Not at all, sir. Just clarifying," she said, as the morning traffic continued to flow past them, with occasional vehicles slowing to observe the tense scene. Shaq found it increasingly difficult to focus on his group call. He glanced up from his notes, watching the interaction briefly before trying to resume his work. He'd seen his mother handle situations like this with grace before, trusting her ability to resolve it quickly. But then, a raised voice snapped him out of his focus entirely. The officer's tone had shifted, sharper and more aggressive. "Step out of the vehicle," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Shaq's head shot up, alarm spreading across his face. He watched as his mother slowly unbuckled her seatbelt, her movements careful and deliberate. "What's going on? May I ask why I need to leave the vehicle?" Lucy questioned, her voice still calm but tinged with concern. "I said step out of the vehicle now, with your hands where I can see them." The officer's response was immediate and harsh. In that moment, Shaq knew this was no ordinary traffic stop. He quickly ended his call with Coach K and his team, apologizing and promising to reschedule. As he put down his phone, he realized that what had started as a routine journey had suddenly taken a dangerous and unexpected turn. The peaceful morning had transformed into a tense confrontation, and Shaq found himself facing a situation that would require all his and his mother's, strength and composure to navigate. The tension in the air was palpable as Lucille slowly opened the car door, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. She stood tall, calm but with a questioning look in her eyes at the unnecessary aggression. Shaq watched, growing more alarmed, his imposing frame still seated in the passenger side, unsure of how to proceed without escalating the situation. "Ma'am, turn around and put your hands behind your back," the officer commanded, his voice harsh and unyielding. Lucille's voice remained steady as she responded, "Officer, I don't understand. I've done nothing wrong. I assure you I haven't been swerving between lanes. Can you please explain why I'm being treated this way?" Her question was met with sudden, unnecessary force. The officer roughly grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back. Lucille let out a cry of pain, the sound piercing the air and cutting straight through Shaq's heart. "Hey, what are you doing? Let go of me!" Lucille's voice cracked with indignation. Unable to contain himself any longer, Shaq quickly exited the vehicle, his protective instincts kicking in. "Hey, what are you doing? That's my mother," he called out, his deep voice carrying across the roadside. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut around Lucille's wrists filled the air as Shaq approached, his imposing frame drawing the immediate attention of both officers. The second officer, who had been hanging back, now stepped forward, his hand hovering near his holster. "Sir, step back. This doesn't concern you," the first officer warned, one hand still gripping Lucille while the other hovered near his weapon. "Like hell it doesn't," Shaq snapped, striding toward them. His sheer size and presence were impossible to ignore. "That's my mother you're manhandling, and I'm Shaquille O'Neal. She wasn't driving recklessly. What are you doing to her?" "This woman was driving recklessly," the officer replied curtly, his grip on Lucille tightening. "And I don't like her attitude. Now, as I said, step back, or you're under arrest too." Shaq's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. His mother's face was a mix of fear and pain, a look he had never wanted to see on her. He realized this wasn't just about his mother's driving, it was about something far uglier. A systemic issue he had hoped to address in his speech later that day, now, something he was experiencing firsthand on the side of a Georgia highway. Shaq stood his ground, heart pounding with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "Do you even know who you're messing with?" The first officer smirked, unmoved by Shaq's celebrity status. "Doesn't matter who you are. Step back or you're under arrest," the officer warned. "You can't just detain us for no reason," Shaq growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no proof of any wrongdoing. I was in the car with her. She wasn't driving recklessly. Let her go now." The second officer advanced toward Shaq, handcuffs in hand. "Sir, we've warned you. If you don't step back, I'll have to detain you as well," the officer warned firmly. But Shaq wasn't about to stand by and allow his mother to be treated unfairly. He stepped forward once more, trying to reason with them. But before he could get far, the officer cut him off. "That's it. You're under arrest for interfering with a police investigation," he stated as the cold metal of handcuffs closed around Shaq's wrists. He exchanged a look with his mother. Lucille's eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and resignation, a look Shaq never wanted to see on her face. This was supposed to be a day of inspiration, of sharing their story of overcoming adversity. Instead, they found themselves living through yet another chapter of that very struggle. Shaq promised to find a solution, but just as he was about to request his right to make a phone call, an officer roughly shoved him forward. "Keep quiet unless you want to spend the weekend here as a lesson," the officer snapped as Shaq was led to his small cell. Pacing the confined space, Shaq's mind raced. They needed legal representation, and fast. But before he could ask for his call, he overheard the officers talking in what they thought were hushed tones. Sitting on the hard bench, pretending not to listen, Shaq's ears caught every word of their conversation. "His kind isn't welcome in this city," one officer muttered. "Shame this one's rich, probably has a lawyer," his partner replied. Otherwise, we could have asked for some settlement money to make this go away." "You idiot," the first one hissed. "You stopped a Rolls-Royce. Of course they're loaded. Bribes won't work on people like them." The other officer chuckled darkly. "Hey, you never know. Sometimes these people like to pretend they're rich, renting fancy cars and all. How was I supposed to know this one was actually loaded when I saw the woman driving?" Their conversation devolved into crude jokes about Shaq's size and his mother's small stature, wondering how someone so petite could give birth to such a giant. Each word stoked the fire in Shaq's chest. The casual racism, the hint of past bribes, the mockery of his family, it all painted a clear picture of the systemic issues within the department. As Shaq sat there, listening to their unprofessional and prejudiced remarks, his resolve hardened. This wasn't just about him and his mother anymore. This was about every person who had been wrongly detained and every individual who had faced discrimination at the hands of those sworn to protect and serve. Shaq realized he had an opportunity, not just to right this wrong for him and his mother, but to expose the systemic discrimination that had been allowed to fester for far too long. The officer's laughter faded as Shaq began to formulate a plan. He wouldn't let this go quietly. He wouldn't settle for a hasty release or a half-hearted apology. No, he would make sure this incident had lasting consequences, not just for him, but for the officers who thought they could abuse their power without fear of repercussions. When the opportunity for his phone call came, Shaq didn't hesitate. He dialed his lawyer, Anderson Thornhill. "Anderson, it's Shaq," he said, his voice low but urgent. "I need you at the police station just outside of Mon. My mother and I were arrested under false pretenses. It's complicated. We need you here as soon as possible." Anderson's response was quick and reassuring. "I'm on my way, Shaq. Don't talk to the officers. I'll be there in an hour." True to his word, Anderson arrived swiftly, and the officers' demeanor shifted. Their bravado diminished as legal scrutiny closed in. But when Shaq asked for a word with his lawyer, the officers were caught off guard. "Make it quick," one officer said, leading Shaq to a small room. Anderson's questions came fast. "What's going on?" Shaq explained the situation. The wrongful stop, the unnecessary force, the racism. As he spoke, he could almost hear the wheels turning in Anderson's mind. "I have an idea," Shaq continued, "but I need your help to make it happen. Can you contact the event organizers in Atlanta? Tell them I won't make it, but I want to propose doing the interview right outside this police station instead." Anderson's voice was thoughtful. "That's bold, Shaq. You're talking about turning this into a very public statement." "Exactly," Shaq affirmed. "These officers thought they could intimidate us, humiliate us. We're going to use this to expose the systemic discrimination happening right under everyone's noses. We'll create a permanent record of this incident that can't be swept away." Mr. Anderson considered it for a moment. "It's risky, but it could be incredibly powerful." "Are you sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Shaq replied. As the officers returned to escort him back to his cell, Shaq's mind was set. He was ready to turn this situation into a platform for change. He caught a glimpse of his mother in the hallway. Their eyes met, and he gave her a small, reassuring nod. Help was on the way. Back in his cell, he settled in to wait. The time was ticking, but Shaq knew the plan would take time to come together. Mr. Anderson would work quickly, but setting up an interview on the fly wasn't easy. The minutes dragged by, but Shaq kept his composure. He knew their dignified behavior would contrast sharply with the officers' unprofessional conduct. As afternoon turned to evening, Shaq heard commotion at the front of the station. Raised voices, camera equipment being set up. It was happening. Mr. Anderson had come through. The officers seemed increasingly confused and unprepared. "Take your equipment and cameras outside," one officer barked. "No cameras inside the station. We're here to interview Shaquille O'Neal," one of the reporters shot back. "We have every right to be here." Shaq smiled slightly. The plan was in motion. The officer tried to control the situation, but Anderson stepped in. These reporters have every right to film on public property outside the station. If you're worried about the attention, I suggest you bring Mr. O'Neill out to speak with them." As the officers debated among themselves, the door to Shaq's cell opened. 2 officers walked in, their faces a mix of frustration and uncertainty. "All right, O'Neill," one said gruffly. "We'll release you tomorrow instead of keeping you over the weekend, if you cooperate and remove those crews." Shaq stood up, his imposing frame filling the room. "I'll need these cuffs off," he said calmly. "You still have my mother here." "I'm not going anywhere." One officer reluctantly moved to remove the handcuffs, and Shaq rolled his shoulders, a small sense of victory flooding his chest as he was led toward the exit. "Next time, don't let your mama drive, big guy," one officer taunted. Shaq paused, turning to face the officer. His voice was low, controlled, but filled with intensity. "Is it going to be any different if a black man is driving instead of a black woman?" The officer faltered, unable to respond. Shaq held his gaze for a moment before walking out into the parking lot, where the cameras were already waiting. The reporters were ready, and Shaq stepped into the light. The moment had arrived. "Good day," he began, his deep voice carrying across the parking lot. "I was supposed to speak in Atlanta tonight about overcoming adversity. I never imagined I'd be living that out in such a literal way," he continued, recounting the events of the day, emphasizing the racism, the abuse of power, and the demeaning treatment. This wasn't just about one incident, it was about systemic issues within the justice system. The officers tried to deny everything, but the truth was already out. The officers were visibly rattled. That's when Officer Kenny Lynch stepped forward. He corroborated everything Shaq had said, revealing similar incidents involving the accused officers. The gathering crowd was stunned, and the officers were left on the defensive, unable to prove their version of the story. "Your word against ours," one officer shouted. But Shaq stood tall, unfazed. "The truth is its own proof," he replied. The truth would not be silenced. Mr. Hans, the department's superior, arrived and took swift action. Officers Martin and Craig were relieved of duty and escorted away. "What happened today will be addressed with the utmost seriousness," Mr. Hans announced. "Officers Martin and Craig have disgraced the badge." Shaq and Lucille stood strong, their composure sending a powerful message. They were not just standing up for themselves. They were standing up for every person who had been wronged.